Britain goes to the polls next month to elect a new government. During the last major electoral exercise in the UK, last year's Scottish referendum on independence, the media coverage was an issue. It wasn't just the newspapers, which are still under the microscope after that phone hacking scandal at Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation and the subsequent judicial inquiry into the relationship between politics and the press in the UK. The BBC was accused of an anti-independence, pro-Westminster bias. Complaints about what is broadcast in the UK go to the regulator, the Office of Communications, short form Ofcom. But the thing about Ofcom is that it enforces the rules on every news outlet broadcasting in the UK except for the BBC. There's a separate body for that called the BBC Trust. So Ofcom can take action against RT, which is based in Russia, or Press TV, which is owned by the Iranian government, or Rupert Murdoch's Sky News, but it has no power over the BBC. To say that that displeases Murdoch understates the case. Murdoch's News Corporation wants Ofcom abolished. Before the last election, David Cameron was saying the same thing. But Ofcom's still in existence, and with this election apparently going right down to the wire, there is every chance that Ofcom will outlast the Cameron government. The Listening Post's Phillips now on the British broadcasting regulator with a big responsibility and a limited mandate.
Ceremony which is a tradition of centuries. The yeoman of the guard on the way, this unpredictably seem as old as time itself. Glorious sea of stars.
My lords and members of the House of Commons.
June 2001. Queen Elizabeth II unveils the government's new proposal to regulate broadcast media operating in the UK.
A draft bill to create a single regulator for the media and communications industries.
The outcome, the creation of Ofcom, the Office of Communications, an independent media watchdog set up to monitor and punish, among other things, television outlets which do not exercise due impartiality or exhibit bias.
Ofcom's a really interesting setup, and it's a really interesting success. It's a regulator that has worked. It was set up to really look after, administer, adjudicate two things. One of which was the commercial competition between the commercial broadcasters. And secondly, to make sure that the content that was delivered to the British public also met various standards.
They're there to protect people from receiving material that is offensive or racist or ideologically unclear, unmarked. But probably their most significant responsibility is through their impact on plurality, a multitude of voices that follow a certain set of well-understood rules about how to present information and how to look at facts.
A quick survey of its recent investigations into Channel 4 throws up a few cases. There's a fine for biased coverage in a news report, and another for a badly timed broadcast of something called the political slot. In terms of actual retributions, that's it. Jon Snow, the long-standing presenter of Channel 4 News, took some heat for his supposedly pro-Palestinian reporting on Gaza last July.
In a very densely packed urban area, if you decide to throw missiles, shells and the rest, then undoubtedly you will kill children.
But because the video wasn't actually broadcast on TV, only posted online, Ofcom couldn't take any action despite more than 1,000 complaints. There are two more Channel 4 cases currently under review. Complaints were made over alleged bias during televised interviews with party leaders. And 2 months ago, hundreds of viewers complained about a political docudrama that blurred the lines between fiction and reality.
What you'll find if you look to see what Ofcom's done in terms of biased output for the mainstream British broadcasters, there's very few instances of that ever happening. You know, there is an argument that the British outlets are treated in a certain kind of way because the British outlets are very used to long-standing and long-held traditions of impartiality, and therefore impartiality as a code of practice is very much embedded in the way that they work.
I think there are enormous double standards here that, for example, 2,736 members of the public complained to Ofcom about a programme on Channel 5 called Celebrity Big Brother, and Ofcom refused to investigate. One person complained about an RT, a Russia Today current affairs programme called Crosstalk, And Ofcom announced that they were going to open an investigation.
Hello and welcome to
Launched just last month, this is the 5th ongoing investigation into RT. This time looking at whether anti-Western comments about the situation in Ukraine were duly impartial.
Yanukovych never did anything against the West, and still they wanted to kill him.
Prior to that, Ofcom summoned editors from the Kremlin-funded news channel after 4 reports on the Ukraine were judged to have breached the impartiality code. An Ofcom spokesman told the Listening Post that if RT breaches our due impartiality rules again, we will consider taking further regulatory action. This might include considering the imposition of a sanction, a fine. And then there was the case of Press TV, a channel funded by the Iranian government.
Things came to a head in 2011 when Press TV was fined £100,000 over an interview that was broadcast with a journalist who was actually detained. And what happened in the end was Press TV lost their licence. Ofcom, I fear, may have been under pressure to take action against Press TV. And I think the same thing's happening with RT.
I don't think we have a set of binding rules and clear sets of guidance about what impartiality actually is. And I think part of this is to do with a kind of centre of gravity. You could argue that many British broadcasters have a built-in bias towards certain views of the world. So, for example, British broadcasters will cover the British royal family in a way that is normally deferential, because it sees that that's part of a kind of British cultural tradition. I think it gets much more serious when we talk about economics and economic models.
Part of the problem is Ofcom's official remit. It's narrow. First off, while it can initiate an investigation of its own, Ofcom usually waits for a public complaint before it does anything. Ofcom can't touch anything that's posted online, which in this digital world roots the regulator firmly in the dark ages. Since its board is directly appointed by the government of the day, its impartiality is often called into question. And then there's the issue of double standards.
Ofcom can revoke the licence of a private broadcaster, even one beaming its signal in from Russia or Iran. But it can't touch the world's biggest broadcaster, the BBC, which is based in London and funded not by the government directly, but through a TV licence fee charged per household.
The BBC has had a distinct and particular, as it were, regulatory structure of its own, which used to be called the BBC Governors, it's now called the BBC Trust. The BBC is there to make its own mistakes, because that's what makes it not a state broadcaster. It makes it a broadcaster with a relationship to the state, but above all a relationship to everybody that pays for it, but to whom it is really accountable.
Not everyone agrees with that, starting with the Murdochs. Back in 2009, James Murdoch, the apparent heir to his father's media empire, came down hard on both the BBC and Ofcom.
Unaccountable institutions, like the BBC Trust, Channel 4, and Ofcom.
And as every politician knows, the Murdochs still wield significant influence.
And at that time, David Cameron even made a speech advocating the abolition of Ofcom and the end of all regulation of broadcasting in this country. But the BBC is passing out of the perpetual dogfight that it was in the 35 years in which Rupert Murdoch dominated the conversation around media outlets and the role of the BBC. I would say that there is an absolute bipartisan agreement about A, the importance of the licence fee, B, the importance of the BBC in the global space. And today, 5 years on, you see nothing but plaudits for Ofcom.
That's not entirely true. Ofcom still has its critics. In their political manifestos issued just days ago, each party laid out a very different take on the future for the media industry. Plans for Ofcom may not be seen as the big vote winner in this UK election, but as the Brits head to the polls, Ofcom will be closely monitoring the election coverage, while others will be monitoring what the outcome of the election means for the regulator itself.